Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, it's a theme as old as Russian history itself. Long periods of sometimes brutal rule, followed by sudden bursts of openness and freedom, which end up being just that, bursts. Now, for anyone who's been keeping an eye on the latest recent mass rallies in Russia ahead of the presidential election next Sunday, it's tempting to ask whether we're just seeing the cycle repeating itself right now. Is this really a turning point? Are we really seeing civil society take root? Or is this just another false start? Now, my guest today, Thierry de Montbrial, welcome to our studios. You are the founder of the French Institute for International Relations, one of the most prominent international think tanks here. You spent 35 years, just under 34 years, crisscrossing Russia, far and wide, bearing witness to tremendous changes economically, socially, politically, culturally. You've seen it all. You've spoke to some of the top Russians, and you're here to share some of those views today. I'd like to start at the present, though, with these rallies I was just talking about. 20 years ago, we saw some giant rallies, too, just as Boris Yeltsin was coming to power. A lot of chaos followed that. Are we seeing a repeat of that scenario again? Or do you see something significantly different in this current round of protests?
No, I think it's extremely different. 20 years ago, the Soviet system was falling apart, and it was totally unprepared for such an event. Today, the regime is much stronger, but at the same time, the environment has changed entirely and has become much more flexible or mobile. And of course, what has developed all over these years is the social network effect, maybe in the recent part, the impact of the Arab Spring. And this is exactly what we are witnessing today. But at the same time, the regime remains strong.
That's exactly it. Vladimir Putin remains the dominant politician on the landscape.
No doubt about it.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but when you leave the big cities, you leave Moscow, St. Petersburg, a lot of Russians can't even name a single opposition leader.
No, absolutely. And even in Moscow, I would say that those who are demonstrating actually are the well-off people. Actually, they are the generation, the new young generation usually, but they are well-dressed, they are cozy. And they are the people who have become what they are thanks to Putin, which seems to be paradoxical. But historically, it's not totally surprising. After World War II, Churchill won the war, and then he was defeated in the elections.
With Putin, it's interesting. Some people look at him and they say he has a very dismissive attitude towards a lot of the opposition. I saw a cartoon recently where the opposition was on a little Petri plate on a microscope, and he was saying, negotiate with who? With them? And they're a tiny little thing. He does see them in a very small, insignificant way still.
Yes. I think Putin is actually a remarkable figure. He's a very powerful man. He's extremely intelligent. I think he really, sincerely wants to reform Russia and to leave the name of the one who saved actually Russia from the chaos after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But at the same time, he's not very pleasant. I have met him in various circumstances. He's not graceful, to say the least.
He's not charming?
Well, yes and no, but fundamentally no.
He's also an ex-KGB agent. Now, I don't want to make too big a deal of this, but I do want to make a big deal of this because it would seem that's a very significant part of someone's upbringing. This was an entire culture that he came from. Do you believe he has been able to go beyond that? He's still a part of it, is he not?
Yes, but as you know very well, intelligence in the Soviet Union, actually that was the elite, because they had fundamentally two missions. One was to preserve the existence of the Communist Party, of the rule of the Communist Party, and the second one, of course, was to be well informed about what was going on within and outside the country. And the leaders of the intelligence, the KGB, were extremely well educated. They were actually the top of the top. And it's no surprise that these people, and also they are very good, they are experts in power, in power technologies, to speak as the Soviets would do.
And perhaps, let me just make the argument, perhaps they're too expert in power, in knowing how to keep power, preserve power. And I'm wondering, these people live in their own world. They live in their own bubble. Do they have actual respect, do you think, for this new segment of society that's protesting?
Respect, I don't know. I think they are able to understand that. But there is one thing that one should never forget about Putin, which is that 4 years ago, he might very well have picked up, for instance, Igor Ivanov as the next president. Igor Ivanov, who was a minister of defense, he was actually a colleague of Putin in the KGB, and he has a bit charming, by the way. Igor Ivanov has a certain charm. And in fact, Putin picked up not Ivanov, but Medvedev. And Medvedev, he's much younger. He's a pure civilian.
And more pliable, though. He was very docile.
Exactly. And he was educated as a lawyer. He has nothing to do with the services, with intelligence services. And I think it was a well-thought choice. One should never forget that. And I am convinced that Medvedev has played a positive role in the last 4 years in terms of the promotion of democracy, and will continue to play a role.
But really, because there are a lot of people who would say just the opposite, that Medvedev will be remembered by history as the man who's not remembered by history. He was the quintessential puppet, just really filling space until Putin could reassume that role.
Of course, it's too early to decide between the two theses, but my judgment is that he's a very intelligent man. He was not, is not so weak, and I think that he was relatively successful in promoting some positive ideas and expressing a certain understanding of what a democratic society is and should be.
Sticking with that theme of a democratic society, we speak in the West a lot about democracy, and then we say Russia in the same breath. Now, you warn in your book against this idea, this notion of democracy imposed by the West. What sort of model of democracy do you think is applicable to Russia?
There is no model of democracy. You have principles of democracy. You have fundamental values of democracy. But in practice, for instance, the American democracy and the French democracy are very different models. They are so different that sometimes the French do not understand at all what is going on in the United States and vice versa. For instance, the first election of Bush, of George W. Bush, was totally ununderstandable, incomprehensible. So we have different forms of democracy. I think that Russia is much more democratic today than it was in the 90s. In the 90s, many commentators make the confusion between democracy and anarchy. We had anarchy in the 90s.
And a lot of Russians would have said that as well.
And they are right. So I think that we have the beginning of that's the beginning, and it will continue, I suspect.
So you're optimistic. I mean, what about the old historical, let's go back to the historical thesis. Russia is simply too big, too much mud, too many distances, the soil isn't good, you can't govern this country. It's ungovernable unless you have that so-called iron fist.
Yes, but of course things are changing today very fast, if only because of the social networks. I think the technological developments are going to have everywhere, huge impact on politics.
And civil society as well?
And of course the civil society. And as for the civil society, everything has to be built up in Russia. And I like to compare Russia with France. Even in France, the most associations or significant organizations of the so-called civil society have to be subsidized by the state in order to survive.
So France and Russia are more similar, perhaps, than France and the United States, based on what
maybe I think the France and Russia are closer to each other. You are right, than France and the United States in certain respects. But in France, we have some democratic culture, of course, because we fundamentally have the same values as those of the United States, because we are the two children actually of the Enlightenment.
Running out of time, final question. Let me have a pessimistic scenario for the future of Russia after Putin wins. You have a few clusters of cities with enlightened, cosmopolitan, educated people. People are seeing protests now, and the rest of Russia. A mass of people who just are out of the loop, the informational loop, and they just want a strong leader.
I think it will. I wouldn't choose between two optimistic or pessimistic scenarios. It will take time. Change will take time, and but the interesting question is that if we had met 2 or 3 months ago, I would probably have told you, like most observers, that Putin would be re-elected and would make 2 terms from now till 2024.
So briefly, and now you don't think, now you think maybe 1 term?
No, I think he is more likely to have only 1 term, and it's even conceivable that he would not go till the end of that term.
So things are moving that quickly right now, in your opinion?
Quickly, and things will continue to move quickly. And I hope at the same time that Russia will continue to be governed because they have too much suffered from chaos.
We're going to have to leave it there, not with the chaos, but with the hopeful scenario, perhaps. More change, quick changes, but we still don't know exactly what. Thierry de Montbrial, thank you very much for being our guest today. You've traveled far and wide across Russia for the past 35 years, and we've been talking about the current situation and the election to come this Sunday. Thanks all of you for watching the interview here on France 24.